Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. And this week we are kicking off a short series of personal development topics around things like your mindset, health and wellness, relationships, and a really cohesive overview of all of the different components of personal development that we tend to, as people, be working on, headed toward. And we wanted to start out with what we believe is the most powerful component of your personal development process, and that is your mindset.
It's fundamental for everything else because like all of our behavior, all of our personal growth comes from how we think about ourselves and think about that journey in our lives.
Yeah, your mindset is basically the garden. It's the soil that everything else grows from. So we wanted to focus in on a couple aspects of mindset. In particular, we want to define mindset a little bit, but we in particular want to talk about the concept of what one of our favorites, Robert Anton Wilson, calls a live mind versus a dead mind, and how to develop what he would define as a live mind. But first, let's talk a little bit about what a mindset is. Your mindset is defined as your fixed mental attitude or disposition that predetermines your responses to an interpretation of situations. So basically, it's your mental habits that you build over time, which influence how you see life and how you're going to be behaving, essentially. One of my favorite synonyms for mindset is your mental inertia. So effectively, how you're going to show up, how you're going to interpret situations, how you're going to pattern recognize is all built on the infrastructure of where your mindset starting point is. So you can see how important your mindset is, how important it is to be thoughtful, be aware of what your actual mindsets are, and be thoughtful about how you craft them. Now, I mentioned mindset as sort of a singular thing before, and now I'm referring to it in plurality, and that's because we actually do have multiple different mindsets running at the same time, depending upon our influences and depending upon, maybe how much we've adopted from the outside world, how much we've outsourced. We could have many different mindsets running at the same time that look kind of similar to each other, but are actually different ways of approaching life. So being able to determine what your mindsets are and what direction they're all headed, and then thoughtfully crafting them to be the kind of mindset that you want as the soil in your garden is a pretty big deal. And I think that's one of the reasons why we want to kick off this entire series on personal development specifically with mindset.
Yeah, if you think about the word mindset, that word set, S-E-T, oftentimes I think of something that people, or at least I've seen this in my past, in my life, something that's set of my identity or how I think about something. It's set. It's a static piece of the way I think about my identity, about something in my life. And what I'd like to have us do is shift that idea of something that's set, it's static, into something that's set on a trajectory. So we're setting it on a course rather than a static identification of something in the moment. It's something that's moving, it's fluid, and it's a trajectory. So mindset isn't something that's fixed, but it's on a trajectory of movement forward.
Right. Well, and it's important to remember that your mindset will be for a time it's like your default setting, effectively. Like it over time, it has the ability to change. It is plastic over time, especially if we're thoughtful about it. However, how we program our minds, how we set them for a time, will be informing in a very unconscious way how we're approaching life. So it's important to understand how it's plastic and how it's static. It's not fully one or the other. It is not an entirely static situation where you can't ever change it, but it's not so plastic that you can change it in the moment. It's almost like, think of it as the GPS system in a plane. It's plastic in the sense that before you start your journey, you can go in and program anything you want into that autopilot, into the GPS unit. However, once you've got something in there, for the time that you're on the flight, that's pretty much what you're going to be doing, that whatever's set in the autopilot, unless you rest it back for some reason, which most pilots do not. Most of what is done on a plane right now is done through autopilot. So think of it as your mindset as something that at times you have the ability to go in and program. At times you have the ability to render it plastic and changeable. However, once you get going, once you're like in a decision point or once you're on a trajectory of behavior or action, you're probably not going back and revisiting your autopilot very often, because why would you? You already said it. You already made those determinations beforehand. So the mindsets that we're working with are effectively the programming we put into our autopilots. So there are times and moments when we can be thoughtful about them and reprogram that GPS. But for the most part, once we're getting going, once we're on a trajectory, once we're out and behaving and out and about, we've pretty much decided how we're going to behave based on those mindsets. So it's good to be aware of when you can affect and impact them, and how you can utilize those quiet times to thoughtfully go through your mindsets and figure them out. And then also recognize that once you program them in, you're probably not going to be spending that much time trying to reprogram them. That's kind of the point of a mindset, is it puts you on that, again, that mental inertia. If you keep going back and reprogramming them constantly, then you're not going to get very far. But at the same time, if you set it and forget it and never reprogram it, you're also probably not going to get very far. You're going to end up in a hamster wheel. So it's a matter of understanding the balance of how mindsets work and what kind of relationship you should be having with it.
So if we look at the mind like a GPS system, when we get to a decision point or we're doing things in life and we come up against that, we've probably already made that decision. Not probably, we have already made that decision by how we are allowing our minds to operate, how we're allowing our minds to be programmed, what we're thinking about. The decision has already been made by what we're feeding ourselves into that GPS unit of the mind. And just like an autopilot on an airplane, it'll carry us to our destination. In your life, you're listening, you've probably had this happen. You've driven to work in the morning or somewhere, and you get there and you go, I don't remember driving here. I don't remember how many stoplights I went through. I don't remember the traffic patterns. I was just listening to music. I was on autopilot in my mind. I got myself to my desk, and I have no clue how I got here this morning. And it's only when you hit like a snarl of traffic or a road closure or something like that you've got to find a new pathway to work, and you usually remember those trips to work in the morning because your quote-unquote mental GPS system was thrown out of frame. The reason this happens, as humans, our minds and our bodies are always looking for homeostasis, and they're always looking for the most efficient way to do things. So our mind wants efficiency. It wants to streamline our neural pathways to get us to work with the least amount of mental effort. So it just puts things on autopilot. Our brains do this for us because they're trying to use as little resource as possible. However, that means that you're not putting conscious thought into a lot of the things that are happening in your life, a lot of the decisions that are happening in life, a lot of the challenges you come up against. You might be falling back on old efficient patterns of your mind instead of thoughtfully thinking about them in new ways, in what we'll call live-minded ways.
That makes sense that the brain would want to do that, because the brain has to deal with so much information all the time that wanting to follow a pattern that is a tried and true pattern inside the mind, it makes complete and total sense that the brain would want to go toward efficiency. However, sometimes what we have in our brains as how reality works is not a particular, it might be a super efficient way of thinking about it because that neural pathway has already been carved, and so the brain doesn't have to really reevaluate it. So it's super efficient, like energetically from their brain. But the neural pathway might be encouraging us toward behaviors that are incredibly ineffective in our life. It's efficient for the brain, but maybe not so much for who we are as people and the things that we're trying to accomplish. So it makes sense that the brain would work this way, but I think really what a mindset does is it allows the brain to land where it wants to land, which is that it doesn't have to constantly be reevaluating all information at all times. It allows it to land in a place where it can automate some of those processes. However, what a mindset prevents us from doing is it prevents us from being overwhelmed by constantly having to reevaluate all information at all times. And it also allows us to head towards a trajectory of behavior once we set it in a right way so that we can get to our end game in that very efficient way. Just like the brain wants to create those neural pathways, we also want to create behavior patterns. We want to be doing things that don't require us to throw ridiculous amounts of energy at the energy hog of our minds. So we have a tendency to talk about, and even maybe possibly in sort of demonized terms, this idea of, be thoughtful, make sure that you're being aware of your decisions, make sure you're not outsourcing all your values. And all of that might sound like we're recommending putting like amplified thought into every moment of your life, which is not what we're actually recommending, because that is a completely unsustainable way of living. What we're recommending is that people be incredibly thoughtful about the autopilot, what they're programming into their GPS autopilot, what they're creating as their mindsets. And so that's why mindset becomes so important. If you want to be the kind of person that doesn't outsource your beliefs and values, if you want to be the kind of person who can take control over the results you're getting because you're being super thoughtful about how you're, about your awareness levels and about how conscious you are of life and how things are panning out for you, then the best way to do it is to retool that mindset, or those mindsets, is to go back to that piece and make sure that your mindsets are set up the way that you want them to be. Now, one of the disciplines that you and I have discovered, Joel, is, as we mentioned before, is what Robert Anton Wilson calls live mind versus dead mind. Now, live mind versus dead mind it's a description of two different styles of thinking. However, our observation has been that if you develop the live mind style, it isn't just a way of being, it becomes a discipline, an active daily discipline that keeps tabs on that GPS autopilot without having to be an energy hog, because the discipline itself becomes an instrument for ensuring that your mindsets are not atrophying. Like, they're not just becoming sort of like an entropic, stagnant thing. It's not going towards a dead place. It's actively going towards a live place. So we want to describe what this discipline of live mind is and make a strong recommendation that you pursue it.
I want to make a distinction here. You've probably heard the term already between somebody who's closed-minded and someone who's open-minded. And we're changing a little bit of a tact on this. Now, closed-minded and open-minded to me can also play into dead mind and live mind. But what closed-minded and open-minded to me is, you're willing to take in information. You're willing to open yourself up to new information, but it doesn't necessarily mean, if you're open-minded, that you'll take action on that or make it into what Antonia just mentioned, a discipline of training your mind to be more live-minded. So we want to change from this idea of closed-minded and open-minded to dead mind and live-minded. So what do we mean by live-minded? What do I mean by a live mind? If you look at a dead mind, let's just kind of do a quick comparison chart. I'll rattle off a few of the comparisons between what a dead mind exhibits versus what a live mind exhibits as an example. For example, a dead mind has a static or stuck way of thinking. So there's one identity for yourself, there's one way this thing works, and it's static in your headspace, in your mindset. A live mind, on the other hand, has a dynamic view, not just of how you think about things, but also of yourself. So if I come from a dead mind frame about Joel, I am Joel, I'm an ENFP in the Myers-Briggs system, and I start to talk about all the different things that identify me as who I am in a static sense. A live mind would say something, if I'm looking at a dynamic, I would say, my name is Joel. Currently, I identify as an ENFP in the Myers-Briggs system, and I am Joeling, ing at the end of my name, Joeling. I'm continually becoming different all the time. I'm a dynamic creature. I see myself in a dynamic way because I'm seeing myself through this live-minded filter. The other thing that a dead mind focuses on is problems. So a dead mind is focused on the problem of something, whereas if you compare that to a live mind viewpoint, it's focused on solution or growth. When it sees something, it doesn't focus on the problem. It sees that as a challenge to overcome, grow through, or to develop around. So it has a growth mindset there. A dead mind also is infophobic. It's kind of playing that whole closed-minded idea. It doesn't want to see new information. That might require the mind to change or to see something brand new or to adapt to that information. And so new information can be scary. So dead mind tends to close down and shut out information. Whereas live mind is excited about new information. It's infophilic. It goes forward and tries to get as much information as possible because it understands the discipline of developing a live mindset requires more input. It requires learning things that are new, seeing different perspectives, exposing yourself to things that you might have been exposed to before. And finally, just a quick comparison here. A dead mind is focused on the answers. It's always looking to tie up loose ends. It wants to know the final answer about something. Whereas live mind is more focused on asking the right questions. Finding really great questions that will lead to even more questions is what gets a live mind excited to get up in the morning. It gets it excited to explore the world and to develop and grow. So these are some of the ideas between what we mean by live mind versus dead mind. It's this static versus dynamic. It's problem focused versus growth focused. It's infophobic versus infophilic. It's focused on answers versus focused on questions.
Yeah. Well, and I think one way to sort of encapsulate the whole concept of the dead mind is that there's an assumption with a dead mind, and this might be just an unconscious assumption, but the assumption with a dead mind is that all the answers have already been discovered. And it might not be that we know what all the answers are because we might not accept them, or, they might not be very palatable to us. But if we want to, we actually have the answers to everything at this point. So that's why a dead mind stops exploring, is because it assumes all the answers are actually there. And it is a very underlying belief. It's not a conscious belief. I think most people with dead mind, if you ask them, hey, do we know the answers to everything? They might hem and haw and go, well, maybe we don't know the answers to everything. However, underneath all of that is the assumption that, yeah, we pretty much know, or I pretty much know. I've got the answers to everything. Whereas a live mind makes the other assumption, is that we might actually know the answers to very few things, if anything. And so the live mind feels rewarded by continual exploration, continuing to explore, to ensure that, like you said, we're asking the right questions.
If you're listening to this, you're probably saying, okay, I get this idea of live-minded. You probably lend yourself to having a more of a live mind than a dead mind, because you're listening to this podcast, you're seeking out new ways of understanding yourself, understanding the world. So my speculation, my guess is that you listening, you probably have more of a live mindset. Let's talk about, though, why would someone resist this? What are some of the advantages of this? And the challenges as well. Let's kind of dive into some of the things that might come up for people as they're looking at this. And you too in your life. I struggle with the challenges that come up for me keeping this live mindset. It's natural for us humans to resist change. We want to find that, like we said, things that are efficient, things that are very quick to get done for us, and our minds like to rest into that. But let's detail out some of the advantages now with having that live mindset.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and some of the challenges of building one. I think that's a really good idea. So with a live mind, the advantage is that you learn the skill of being able to alter your perspective or paradigm as new information is discovered. Meaning that when we get, say, new scientific discoveries or new philosophical discoveries, you're able to now accept new input and recalibrate how you see the world based on this new input. So you don't have to go down with the ship if your old paradigm turns out to be wrong. Like if you end up discovering that your information the entire time, the information you were working with, maybe your underlying belief systems are maybe not accurate, or you no longer believe them, you've built the skill of not doubling down on it. You've built the skill of being able to be more flexible and adaptable to new burgeoning evidence or newer, more, like happiness-inducing memes. And so one of the major advantages to a live mind is adaptability. Now, one thing you mentioned before, this idea of like, if you're listening to this podcast, if you're into personal development, if you're into stuff like this, you probably do have a tendency to go more towards live mind than dead mind because you're already pursuing new information. It's good to see it as a sliding scale, though, not as a toggle switch. It's not just an off-on situation where you either have live mind or you have dead mind. It's more of a gradient. So even if you are a person who goes toward live mind, it's a discipline that you implement over your lifetime. It's something that you build skill in consistently. So there's always room for even the most live-minded amongst us to continue to head towards a live-minded way of living. And that presents a challenge. Now, again, it helps you increase in your adaptability. And the more live-minded you go, the more adaptable you become. But it does present a challenge in that it is a discipline. It's a lifestyle. It's like a way of thinking. And so if you are encouraged to have a more dead-minded way of looking at things, if maybe you were influenced by the people around you, or you were in a context that recommended you assume you have all the answers to everything, then it might be a challenge to head towards the live-minded, disciplined way of life, because you're going to take a lot of hits.
One thing I want to talk about for adaptability really quick is I have resisted being the adaptable one in my life before, because I've always seen adaptability as a weakness. Like I'm in a social situation or I'm in a business context, I feel like I've always looked at the people that stand strong for something and they don't adapt to a situation as the ones that really have the power in the situation. And I've really changed my perspective on this last 10 years, where really the person in a situation that's the most adaptable actually has the most power in that situation, because they can flex to whatever needs to be flexed for. Now, we're not talking about being responsive. We're talking about being adaptable, being able to flex and change to circumstances that are beyond your control. It may on the surface feel like you're taking a hit in being adaptable, like you're actually you're the one that has to change. You're the one that has to see something on a higher level. You're the one that has to change your mindset or view around this. But true adaptability gives you tremendous personal power. So the reason why adaptability is good for you listening, and good for me, and good for Antonia, is because it's not about fitting ourselves to others, and that's, let's all be more adaptable because we can mold ourselves to others. It's actually a place of personal empowerment. You have tremendous personal empowerment when you can flex and adapt your mind and your heart and your body to situations that come up for you.
Yeah, it's less a trying to match what other people's beliefs are and take them on for a time. It's less being a chameleon than it is simply being a person who holds things loosely. And so when somebody suggests a perspective, it's not that difficult to just try that perspective on for a time. Even if you don't end up agreeing with them, you can at least try it on for a moment and then be able to sympathize with how the other person sees reality. So it's like putting on clothes. It's the ability to change your jacket quickly, as opposed to forcing everybody else to come to your perspective. And the reason why there's true power there is that your ability to be adaptable with how people think and these different perspectives and belief structures allows you to be highly persuasive, because you can come to the other person with a position of compassion. Like you've tried on how they see things. Your live mind was ready and willing to input new information. And because you were ready and willing to input new information and be able to try on somebody else's, way of seeing things, or their perspective or paradigm or belief system or whatever, because you were able to do that, then now you can come to them with way more information and knowledge and like wisdom around their topic. And then if you feel like maybe there's a better way of seeing things, you're not trying to force them into your perspective. You're meeting them where they're at, and then you're able to kind of guide them in a very persuasive way to maybe also have live mind, also be able to take on the same skill, because you're at that point, you're leading by example. And so the real power is through influence. It's not through force. So this adaptability, it's not a matter of being a chameleon to people please. It's a matter of being willing to meet people where they're at.
Absolutely. So what are some challenges we might come up with as we all try to develop more live mind? One of the things that anytime you're making a major change in your life, and one of the best examples of this is a diet situation where you want to lose weight or get healthy or eat better. You can't do that in a 3-week period. I mean, you've heard this before, right? Anytime you've been around like a weight loss advisor or guru, they say, yeah, you can diet and lose some weight in a month and do a crash diet. But if you don't change your lifestyle, if you don't change how you think about this on a holistic level, how you eat every day for the rest of your life, how you move and exercise every day for the rest of your life, you're not going to see true change in your life. So I think one of the challenges in this is it can't be something that's short term. It has to be something that we develop as a discipline or a lifestyle in how we develop this live-mindedness, how we think about live-mindedness, seeking out ways to continually increase that as a lifestyle in and of itself.
And there is a lot of payoff when you're trying to take your metaphor, Joel, of changing your diet. There's a lot of payoff to eating really crappy in the moment. Like our brain gets a lot of reward from maybe some like high sodium or sugar content or levels that is in our food. And our brain goes, ooh, I really like that. And dead-mindedness gives us the same kind of hit. It's like a really quick, it's a really quick sort of sugar rush when we assume we have all the answers. When we come from a dead-minded place, it means that we always get to be right because we have all the answers. We don't need to explore anything more. And so our ego gets sort of this sort of delicious sugar rush initially when we go, ooh, I already knew the answer to that. So there's a quick hit payoff that is sometimes difficult to let go of. But just like when you're moving your diet from a junk food diet to a nutrient-dense diet, the payoffs come over time, which is like, oh, my joints feel better, or maybe I'm not going to die of heart disease as young. The payoff is more of a longer game. And so one of the things that is a major challenge for people when they're moving towards a live-minded way of, or a mindset, live-minded mindset, is that their ego is going to start taking some hits. Just like, when you go to a nutrient-dense diet, you're not going to have as many tasty food experiences initially until your whole palate acclimates to this new food. Eventually, your body will start to crave the nutrient-dense foods and they'll taste good. But initially, they don't. They taste terrible. Somebody who's been raised on McDonald's is not going to think that, like a super food green smoothie is going to be delicious. It's going to take a while to get to the point where the body goes, I really want that. And so I'm going to make you think it tastes really good in order to get it. And the same thing happens with dead mind to live-mindedness. Your ego will be taking consistent hits because as you move from dead mind to live mind, the number one thing you're going to experience is, oh, I was wrong about that. You're just going to feel that over and over and over. Ooh, I was wrong. Ooh, I was wrong. And you're going to have to get used to that feeling. Your ego will be dying a little bit every day when you go towards live-mindedness. But just like with that nutrient-dense foods, at the end of it, you eventually get to the place where you're not so tied to needing your ego to be, sort of stroked. Just like when you get to a point with your diet, you don't need that sugar rush or that sodium rush in order to feel like, or that feeling of being super full, which happens sometimes with diets. Like we have to eat a ton of food in order to feel okay, like we're satisfied. Your body now acclimates to going, I'm satisfied because I'm getting the nutrients I need, not having a full feeling. The same thing happens with live mind versus dead mind. You get to a point where your ego doesn't want to be stroked anymore. It doesn't want that full feeling or that sugar rush anymore because it knows where that leads. It leads to something that's not healthy for it. So it gets to a point where when you are proven to be wrong about something, now you get a rush because you're like, oh, now this is a hole I can, I can go down this rabbit's hole and I can really explore this. And this might lead to some really interesting information. So instead of having pain when you get an ego hit, you now actually experience a reward when you get an ego hit because your live-minded long game feels really good about that. It goes, oh, awesome. Now I have more information. I can be infophilic, like you mentioned. I can love new information and I can now explore this piece. So the challenge is getting through that. Just like the diet, the challenge is getting to a place where you now experience healthy, nutrient-dense foods as good for you and delicious and you crave them. When you go from dead mind to live mind, you know that you're really getting into the discipline and it's now a self-sustaining discipline because it enjoys the feeling of being wrong.
You say that it'll get easier and that you enjoy feeling wrong. I've been working a lot on trying to take more ego hits in my life and developing this live mind. And so far it's still tough for me as a person. I don't know if you enjoy the ego hits, Antonia, but I certainly still don't enjoy them. It hasn't gotten to the place for me where I'm like, yeah, this is awesome. Like I'll articulate to you. We'll be in an argument and you'll bring something up and I'll be like, all right, I'll take a deep breath. I'm like, this is a huge ego hit for me, but I have to admit that you're right about this thing. And it's like, I feel awful admitting that. Like, I feel like I'm giving I'll even tell you this. I feel like I'm giving something up of my identity to tell you that you're right about this thing. And I feel like my guts are being ripped out of myself. Like my heart's being ripped out and I'm losing a sense of myself whenever I do that. So I would say that even if in spite of feeling bad, don't expect it to feel great. Even if it feels bad, it's still going to be healthy for you. And I think there are people that the green smoothie in the morning never tastes good for them, no matter how long they drink it, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, you're like, I don't even know who I am anymore. And you might get to a point where your ego feels that way, where it's like, who am I? I'm not sure who I am because I was so sure of who I was, but that's all now up for debate every day, all the time. I think there's probably aspects of it. That's my suspicion, because I have gotten to a point, like, let's take health and wellness as a continued metaphor that we're using. I have gotten to a point where I'm craving my superfood smoothie in the morning. Like, it's delicious to me. When I drink it, I'm just like, oh, it feels so good. However, when I was running on a regular basis, which I stopped running about 4 years ago, and I need to get back into it. That's my radically honest moment of saying that, yeah, I've kind of been falling down on that. But one of the reasons why is because I never got a runner's high. I would run 2 days on, 1 day off, and I did that for a decade, and I got a runner's high twice. The entire time. I ran hundreds of times, and I got a runner's high twice. And in both times, I'm like, oh, now I get it. Now I understand why people run marathons. And then, the run would be over, and I just wouldn't be able to replicate it. So in that way, I never took to running. It was always difficult. That was always painful for me. But food, no problem. I'm at a point right now where nutrient-dense foods are delicious. And there's probably other people who feel the opposite, that food will always taste bad to them when they're eating nutrient-dense foods. But, they can get a runner's high, or whatever other aspect of the health and wellness discipline suits them better, like just who they are and how their makeup is. So mindset is very similar, and live-minded set is very similar, because when you're in a live mind, it's going to touch every aspect of your life. And in some ways, you're probably going to have an easier time of taking those ego hits. I mean, I know that what you're talking about, I know those moments when you're like, oh, okay, all right, I'm going to have to sort of reorient my identity to accept this new piece of information that's really painful. And yet in other ways, we'll have conversations around something that you've discovered you were wrong about the past, and you're gleeful. Right? Like, you're like, oh, that's like, oh, I totally used to think this thing, and now I think this. And like, that's so much better. I feel so much better about that particular reframe. So I think it's probably going to be, as a discipline, there's probably going to be areas that are easier and more difficult depending upon what kinds of ways your ego takes a hit. However, it's still, even though I hate running and I got a runner's high all of twice in my entire running career, doesn't mean that exercise is not something I should continue to do. So I think probably just reminding yourself of the areas in which you are willing to take those ego hits and they don't feel bad. Remind yourself that you're getting the same results when it still hurts, and to keep going. Because eventually we all get to a place where it feels good. It's just like the whole thing, holistically, the ego is no longer asserting itself so aggressively or so obnoxiously, and you get to a point where it's going to be, I mean, you know that it's going to be okay.
Well, yeah, and I would say I've never, like, a day later gone, oh, I still feel. It's usually a taste thing, in the moment thing. Just like you're tasting the green smoothie, but 2 hours later, your whole body's going to feel elevated. You feel amazing. You didn't like the taste on your tongue, but you still know you got the payoff later. So it's the taste of the ego hit in the moment that may never go away for you. I guess I'm just warning you as you're listening. You might still deal with that, but just know once the taste is done, once you've, washed the taste out of your mouth with some water, metaphorically speaking, you're going to feel great later on after that. But in the moment, it still can be a challenge, and I try to focus on this, and it's still a challenge for me feeling bad in the moment for this. And I think that's just something I want to highlight here. When we talk about live mind, this idea of open-mindedness is changing our perspectives about things that are external of ourselves, thinking of new information, taking in new information, thinking about things in different ways. But I think that the biggest challenge when you start to work on developing a live mindset is you're going to have to think about yourself differently. You're going to have to see your identity different, and how you show up to the world, and how you express yourself, and who you are as a person. And that is like some of the hardest work that I've ever gone through in my life. And I'm sure you listening, if you've ever done some ego work or working around how you show up or how you identify yourself, creating a dynamic view of yourself that's adaptable. You're not, it's not the same as like blowing with wherever the wind takes you or whatever the social dynamic is. I'm not talking about just going along with what people do in the moment. I'm talking about being adaptable over time, flexing your identity and your live mindset to situations. It is some of the most challenging stuff that I've ever personally gone through in my life.
Yeah.
And it continues to be challenging. And I hopefully can continue to scale up by increasing how I get that live-mindedness into myself, into my life.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think, I mean, you bring up some fair points. The thing is, it's not always going to feel good. It's an idealistic perspective to say that. I mean, it's painting the sort of the goal as being really good because we want to get to the goal, which is eventually you get to a point where your bruised ego is going to be okay. It's not going to feel as bruised anymore. But there are along the way some legit ego hits that are not going to feel good and will continue to not feel good for a while. I mean, I haven't gotten 100% to that egoless place all the time where, like I'll receive criticism without, having a reaction or response. My live-minded journey is always continuing as well. So even if I'm like, hey, you're going to get to a point where it's not going to hurt as bad, like that's me too. I'm talking to myself as well. So I think that's a legit thing to point out. And I think the other thing too is I want to make it clear that we're not saying that you can't ever stand for anything. It's not that a live-minded mindset is going to never believe anything strongly or stand for something or want to fight for anything. It's that a live-minded mindset constantly, like, it has enough reevaluation moments to ensure that what you're fighting for is worth fighting for. It's to check in on a regular basis and be radically honest with the thing that you have a stake in. It's okay to have a flag in the ground. It's okay to have a stake in something. It's okay to fight for something. It's just you want to make sure that the thing you're fighting for is still the thing you want to be fighting for. So I think that's one of the reasons why the discipline of live-mindedness is so helpful, is that it ensures that you won't, 10 years later reevaluate your life and go, I think I was betting on the wrong horse there. I wish I had reevaluated that, maybe 10 years ago. Maybe I wasn't ready to at the time. But when you develop the discipline, then you get to a space where you are ready to constantly be reevaluating. And you can still fight for the things you're fighting for. You're just making sure that that's definitely the direction you want to go.
Let's talk about some strategies for developing more of a live mind in our lives. What are some disciplines, some ways of seeing the world, some ways of moving through the world that will help us develop this, some practical things that will help us develop live mind?
Well, on a really sort of gross level at the baseline, it's a matter of pursuing content and information that directly contradicts some of your most, your most beloved beliefs and paradigms. If you've got something that you are really attached to, then a live-minded discipline would recommend that you not adopt the opposing perspective, but that you keep yourself aware of and constantly inputting the opposite perspective. So like a really easy way to demonstrate this would be like if you're a lifelong Republican, then you subscribe for a full year to, a service that provides you with the Democratic perspective, and vice versa. If you're a lifelong Democrat, then you sign on to Republican news sources and you do that for a time, not just one, but you do it for like a year. If you are, if you have a very firmly held religious perspective, then you might want to consider subscribing to something like Skeptic Magazine, and vice versa. If you are a person who is like a lifelong skeptic, then pursuing, like maybe services, religious services, or not even religious services. It could just be anything that has a spiritual tone to it, and that you pursue it enough, not just for like, a couple services, but actually like for a time. So that's the easiest way to demonstrate how to do this, is that you, like, your guiding star is anytime you feel attached to a perspective, to a belief system, to a paradigm, you actively seek information that directly opposes it. And so over time, one of the things that is really scary about this is that, or at least it was scary for me when I was growing up, is I was told that was not acceptable. Like, it's not okay to pursue information that directly contradicts your beliefs because now you're going to get persuaded by them. But that's kind of the point, is that you are being persuaded by them. And is it because you're being so open-minded? I remember the phrase, you're so open-minded that your brain falls out, which is kind of a silly metaphor. It's kind of a ridiculous thing to say, because the more open your frame, the more you're willing to input, the more you can look critically at all things. And it's not, again, that you fully adopt the other perspective. It's that you open your ego up to taking whatever hits are available to it if something in the opposing perspective is maybe persuasive to you, or maybe refines how you already feel. Maybe it's just a refinement process. You stay believing the thing you currently believe, but now you've refined it, and maybe you've looked at it a little more critically, so that even within the context of that belief system, you're now even more clear on what it is your target is. Because remember, the goal of Live Mind isn't necessarily to change your mind all the time. The goal of Live Mind is to make sure that you're betting on the right horse.
Yeah, and if you can see it as a way, like, I want to understand this perspective. I want to understand where this is coming from. I want a full picture. I can still stay true to my beliefs or my stances on things, but I truly do want to understand the most fidelity, understanding of the other position on something. Like if I'm a very liberal person, I'm trying to understand the conservative mindset. What drives that mindset? How do they think? Why are they choosing this lifestyle or this way of seeing the world? And if I can truly understand that, and they might have some valid points that you've not thought about, that you go, oh, I see why they're thinking this thing, but I can also see this over here. And then you start to make connections between those. You get a much more rounded view of how you show up to the world. And again, it's leading to that empowerment principle where you are now able to really, truly get into someone else's perspective, understand where they're coming from, and you feel more empowered from your own standpoint as well, because you have a much more nuance and understanding around all of that.
One of the major things that Live Mind helps us do is it helps us question our assumptions. And we don't know how many assumptions we have until they start getting questioned. And so pursuing information that goes contradictory or counter to just a really a highly attached belief or perspective, one of the things that comes from it, even if you maintain that perspective, is that you now have some of your assumptions refined. You question some of your baseline assumptions about maybe how other people see things. And so a live mindset will allow you to be curious. It comes from a position not necessarily of assuming it's going to, switch horses in the middle of the race, but it's more of a curiosity perspective. It's an exploration perspective.
Another practical tool that I've implemented, and I hinted to it earlier, when I'm going through an opening or trying to get into a live mind framework, and that ego hit comes up for me. A strategy I've had, now I trust the people in my life when this happens. I don't say this to perfect strangers, and I'm starting to get to the place where I'm almost able to do this with strangers as well, is I call out what's happening for me in the moment. And it kind of gives me a way to allow my ego to not feel so assaulted. So I'll say, literally, Antonia and I will be in a conversation, and she'll say, have you thought about this perspective or this idea about yourself, or have you seen yourself in this way? And I'll take a deep breath, and I'll literally say out loud, okay, I feel like my ego is taking a huge hit by admitting this, but, and then I spell out what's happening for me. Like, I think you're right on this point, and I think I need to change how I see this about myself or this perspective. And just by calling out the fact that my ego is taking a hit helps me not feel so, it's like now I've got another person to share with me the feelings that come up around that, because it's so powerful of a resistance, or I think my ego is trying to save my life in a sense. It's almost like panic, like I'm giving over my very survival to this new idea, because it almost feels like I'm dying inside sometimes. But calling that out, being able to articulate what's going on for you with words and verbalizing it, allows your emotions to have something to latch onto, so you can then work with that strong ego hit that's coming up for you. So that's a strategy that I've employed in my life when I'm trying to get to more live-mindedness, is call out what's happening for me in the moment and the hits I'm taking.
Yeah, that's actually, I mentioned before about guiding stars and using contradictory information or information that counters what you already believe. I actually say probably the more accurate guiding star is those ego hits, like following the triggers. If you get triggered by something, I think we've gotten to a point in our society where we think a trigger means somebody else did something to us that was bad. All a trigger is that your ego is having a moment of flare up effectively. And so use those triggers as moments to allow your ego to have basically a moment of reevaluation. So if you get triggered, if you're having a moment when your ego is flaring up, my recommendation is, just like you mentioned, call it out. That's a great way of doing it. And then also give yourself permission to have a moment. Like, give your ego a moment to have like a rest, because those triggers can be painful. And so call it out, acknowledge what's happening, and then tap out for a moment and let your ego have a rest where it goes, oh, okay. All right, that was not a good one. That one hurt really bad. Okay, but I'm going to keep going. And so eventually you get to a point where your ego isn't hurt by those triggers anymore. You basically become eventually untriggerable, just about untriggerable. Now, I'm not 100% untriggerable, so this is like idealism for me too. But you do get to a point where the triggers are far fewer in between. You're just not getting triggered as much. So when you're getting triggered, that's actually, you're heading down the right road. And I think one of the major advantages, before we wrap this all up, as you were talking, Joel, I realized that one of the major advantages for me in pursuing the discipline of a live mindset is that I've noticed that both you and I are far less addicted to being right. We don't act like addicts for our beliefs anymore. We used to. We used to be highly addicted to our beliefs. We were like junkies, right? And you can see this when somebody is addicted to a belief system. If you try to take it from them, they start to act like a junkie.
They get the shakes.
That's absolutely it. They're like, because they don't feel like they can live without it. And if you get to a point where you have implemented the discipline of a live mindset to the point that we're talking about, like over time, making it a lifestyle, you will get to a point where you're no longer addicted to your belief. You're no longer addicted to the feeling of being right or having the answers. You don't get the shakes when somebody tries to take a belief system from you. You're more curious, you're more open, you're more accepting of the idea that you could be wrong. And so you don't have all the symptoms of an addict. You don't have this idea where you feel like you have to have this thing, otherwise you can't live. You now are free. You're not a slave to your belief anymore. You're not a slave to this thing that has you by the balls, basically. You're not an addict anymore. And so having a live mindset, building the discipline of it actually is quite freeing. You're adaptable. You don't get the shakes when somebody, questions your belief system. You are far less triggerable. And you get to a point where you recognize that this long game is very healthy for your psyche over the course of your life.
So what do you think? I want to hear from you. You're the third person in this conversation. Do you have a dead mind? Do you have a static way of seeing things? Do you have a live mindset? Do you have a dynamic way of seeing things? How has your ego shown up in the discipline of maybe creating a live mind for yourself? You might have been doing some of these things already and not had the vernacular live mind, but you're like, oh, that's what I've been working on. That's what's been happening for me. Or you might say, man, like this podcast is illustrating something that I really need to open up to. I've been really trying to focus on the answers and the static parts of myself. And they're really making a point here that it would really give me that empowerment. If I can get to a live mindset, that gives me more personal power in the world. That gives me more empowerment. Yeah, it's going to be tough, but I feel good about that. I want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com. You can leave a comment directly below this podcast or ask a question, leave some feedback, share your experience with us. You can also join our community of like minds. It's growing every day. I think we've got tens of thousands of people now gathering over at facebook.com/personalityhacker. We're also on twitter.com/personalityhack. We'd love for you to be a part of that community.
Yeah, I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that we're doing a series of different topics related to personal development, and this week is mindset. And if you're just a podcast listener, if you've only ever listened to our podcast and not gone to our website, I want to recommend that you head over that direction for this series, because we're going to have a lot of interrelated content coming out. So we have this podcast on mindset. We have an article coming out on mindsets as well. It's a little bit more fleshed out, and it includes more concepts around live mind and dead mind and growth versus fixed mindset and some other mindsets. And then we're also recording a series of videos to go with this. So we're going to have videos coming out where we talk about mindsets and awareness and that sort of thing. And we're going to be doing that through the entire series. When we talk about health and wellness, we're going to be we have the same tied in content around there. So if you're not familiar with our website, I recommend that you go check it out and get more content and information around the series of personal development topics. And then also, as usual, head over to iTunes. Subscribe to us if you like this podcast. We can also be subscribed to on a lot of different Android platforms. And then if you want to give us a gift, as usual, one of the best gifts you can give us is to leave a rating and review on iTunes, because that really helps us out. It helps cross-promote us on other podcasts, and it puts us higher in the charts. And that's a gift you can give to us.
You mentioned subscribing on various Android platforms. I just want to mention, if you're listening, you may not know this, but we actually have a Personality Hacker app. It's free for both the Android platform and the Apple platform for the iPhone that you can download, and all of the podcasts and some of our videos and articles all are inside that app as well. It's a great place on your mobile device to have all of our content in one place. So you can basically subscribe or like get our podcast every week just by having that app. So if you want to run over to the Google Play Store or whatever it's called now and download that on the Android platform, or if you're on the iTunes Store, you can download the app. It's just search Personality Hacker and you can download the app. It's got all of the content on there as well. So I just want to mention that to you. Thanks for being with us on this podcast about dead mind versus live mind. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we will talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.